The king is dead. Long live the king. You've probably heard this phrase, or a variation on it. It's a type of cliche called a snow clone. Gray is the new black is another one. This phrase was originally a proclamation made in various European countries following a monarch's ascension to the throne. It stems from the law of le mort s'assied le vif, which states that the transfer of sovereignty occurs instantaneously upon the moment of death of the previous monarch. So, long live the king is referring to the new king who is now in power. Ironically enough, I checked in here this morning on Swarm and stole the mayorship. I'm not sure if that's a good sign or a bad one. Anyway, what does a monarch have to do with web development? Well, it's not like we ever jump from one tool or library or framework to another as soon as something new and shiny comes out. Oh, wait. I'm not saying the community as a whole does this, but there's definitely a trend in which we declare something dead rather quickly. Sometimes it feels the death of the king is a self-fulfilling prophecy, or maybe we're just outright murdering him. Who knows? Anyway, in the last few years, CSS itself seems to have been pronounced dead many times, or at least assumed dead and put in a casket, as preprocessors have taken the crown in the front-end development world. There's a bit of a power struggle, although SAS seems to have the support of the majority of the population behind it. I'm sure some of you try your best to avoid CSS altogether, at least people coming from JavaScript world. How many of you here author style sheets more or less daily? Show hands. All right, so maybe half the room. Now, keep your hands up. Of those that author CSS, how many use preprocessors? More hands went up. All right. So upcoming code examples are using the SAS syntax. I use that, but the concepts are available in any of these tools. So preprocessors are clearly useful, and there's a good reason they're playing such a significant role in modern web development. They've enabled us to do some things that just a few years ago simply weren't possible, or at least easy, with vanilla CSS. You can break code into smaller modules and multiple files. You could create code that's reusable, yet easy to change when needed with features like variables. And they give us the ability to more easily reuse smaller snippets of code across projects. They've even made CSS more beautiful with less typing required. Now, I'm not sure that features like easier to type are really what we need from our main languages. But as the use of preprocessors has grown, I've been looking at the added complexity they bring to the table and have kind of wondered if they're the right approach going forward. Now, before I continue, please put down your pitchforks and torches. I'm not trying to tell you not to use preprocessors. They're awesome. I love them. They give you a lot of flexibility and an approach that works today. I'll be the first to point out now that some of the problems I'm about to describe aren't necessarily problems with the languages themselves, but more maybe with how they're used. So if you're familiar at all with CSS, one of the first features of preprocessors that might have caught your eye is that of nesting. It's a useful feature that allows you to kind of merge the property and selector syntax of your styles together so you can write modular code that's visually self-contained, and you don't have to repeat the parent selector for each element inside of the element that you're targeting. So in this example, you've got the SAS on the left, and you can see that the H1 and H2 elements are inside of the alert, as they might be in the DOM. But with the CSS that gets generated, it gets split out into separate styles so that the browser knows how to handle it. Of course, this can be taken way too far. You might have come across something like this in the past, and trying to debug it is always lots of fun. And you can do this with regular CSS, though it's an easier trap to fall into when you're using a preprocessor. Especially if an author isn't necessarily thinking about the performance implications of this on the generated CSS, because each one of these additional selectors slows the browser down. How much is up for debate, but it can have an effect in the long run. Something else that can come into play with preprocessors is deprecation. Now, this doesn't happen a lot, and I've had conversations with the maintainers of SAS about how this is something that they're actively trying to avoid. They've been very deliberate about features and syntax they add and the possible conflicts with future CSS. However, there have definitely been a few times that I've opened an old SAS project only to find that it's suddenly not compiling and I've got a console full of errors. And then because of that or some other weird configuration issue, you're diving down the rabbit hole into a series of more challenges to figure out what's going on. You're dealing with different versions of your preprocessor, which might need a different version of Node or Ruby, and things spiral out of control. Before you know it, you've lost half your day trying to fix your build. I know that we've gotten better at this, but these preprocessors end up being another build system on top of Grunt or Gulp or whatever you've got running tasks. Sure, the old days where we could just open a CSS file and start editing are long gone for all but the most basic of sites. But isn't some level of simplicity in our workflows something we should aspire to? And I don't think that simplicity is always achieved by throwing more tools into the process. So speaking of which, simplicity and tools, you should remember that preprocessors are just an additional level of abstraction in your project. I'm actually a little bit concerned. I've seen some devs that don't work predominantly in CSS aren't always aware that at the end of the day, all of these do compile back down to CSS. I've heard of some boot camps that teach lesser Sass but don't necessarily teach why. And we're using that as an industry, but sometimes it's not always clear what problems they're solving to people. They're not magic tools. They're conveniences that, at least theoretically, enable us to author style sheets faster. There have been a few articles this year on A List Apart about preprocessors and how to wrangle them. And the one by Liza Danger-Gardner, who's a native Cascadian, got me thinking about not just what approach we should be taking, but about what the future of front-end web development actually looks like. I've spent the last few weeks digging into the CSS spec, W3C working drafts, fooling around in developer tools of various browsers, and talking to the people who make this stuff happen. I've come to a little bit of a conclusion. Preprocessors saved us from CSS, but CSS will save us from preprocessors. Now, it's probably not going to be quite the way you expect, so please keep your mind open to the possibilities here. As you're surely aware, sites have gone from static files rendered on a more or less standard screen size to interactive applications in which it's becoming increasingly difficult to explicitly account for every single variation. So it's rather natural that the first way CSS has started to evolve is to enable the browsers to make certain rendering decisions for us. After a few years of being perpetually on the horizon, Flexbox has finally arrived and is ready for use, unless you still need to support IE 9 or below, in which case you have my condolences. For those of you that are not familiar, Flexbox is a great feature that allows us to describe how our content should lay itself out rather than explicitly setting properties on every element. One of the most useful features is that it can respond to the amount of children that an element has and change the size of those children based on the quantity of them. So it's especially useful in things like content management systems. I came across a tweet a few weeks ago where someone was asking if he could use Flexbox to replace this Sass code, which he had to update every time new content was added or removed. So, it's pretty straightforward. You can imagine he was reusing some code from project to project or in some sort of navigation or grid layout. And sure, this helps make it easier to keep track of everything that's going on, especially if you have a lot of components like this. But isn't one of the ideas behind CSS that your content should be separate from your presentation? At least that's what CSS Zen Garden taught me. This is kind of like the hello world of preprocessor projects, but we're fortunate that we can now handle layouts in these situations in a much more graceful way. With these two styles, our content and presentation layers are further separated. You can imagine you have an item container be set to display flex, and then any items inside of it with this class will automatically be the same size based on this, these simple styles. Doesn't that just give you the warm, fuzzy feeling inside? If you take this a bit further, you can make some really interesting dynamic layouts that would have previously required a lot of preprocessor shenanigans like if statements and loops. Of course, just as King Flexbox arrives, we're eyeing up his replacement. Well, not really, but another tool that we can eventually use for layouts, and this is now only on the horizon, is the CSS grid module. This is useful for describing container behavior at various screen sizes, more so than the content-based approach of Flexbox. I don't want to get into the syntax of it. It's kind of gnarly, but it looks to be kind of a similar approach to actually the way Apple has taken with its native application frameworks for universal apps, if any of you happen to have looked at that before. You can declare flexible columns or rows with minimum dimensions, and of course, use other existing techniques to build the layout as needed. I'm pretty excited to see where this goes. As web technologies continue to be used for application development, features like this will make our lives as interface developers a lot easier. So let's look at some more tangible example of how CSS is evolving directly into the path of preprocessors. Variables has been one of the easiest selling points to get people to use preprocessors. I'm sure I don't have to explain their utility to anyone here. They're pretty straightforward. You declare a variable anywhere in your file, and it gets injected into the CSS at compile time. As you might expect, they're coming in native CSS. They've already been implemented in Firefox if you want to start playing around with them today, and they look a little bit like this, or exactly like this. There is one key difference. You do need a scope to define the variables. I know it's CSS. You might expect it just kind of goes into the global scope, right? But hey, we're moving forward. So anyway, you wrap it in a root pseudo selector, and off you go. Now, I know what you're thinking. They're not as nice to look at as preprocessor variables. Some preprocessors have been all about getting rid of extra syntax, while we're adding even more here. You know what, though? It doesn't matter. One of the incredible things about CSS is that it's both backward and forward compatible. The CSS working group has to make sure that features it adds don't break existing browsers, and that they'll stay compatible in future browsers as new features get added. Because once you get something on the web, it shouldn't break later on. Well, most of the time. Besides, who cares if a variable is a few extra letters to type? Isn't that why we've got other tools like emit if you're really against typing? But you can use variables in preprocessors today, and they look great and work great, so who cares, right? But here's the awesome thing. You can do so much more with CSS variables because they have this awareness of scope that a precompiled static file simply can't match. I could probably give a whole talk demoing their awesomeness, but for now you'll just have to take this example. We declare some variables at the root scope. Excuse me. Then we use them to describe the text color in a div. That div will be hot pink, as you can expect. But now let's add some variable magic and change the value of the green variable inside of a class. Take a look at what happens when we have another div with the class magic. It goes white. Let that sink in for a second. You can redeclare a variable, and all the previous stuff that was inherited comes into it. This is one of those cases where CSS is evolving past the abilities of preprocessors. Of course, I'm not sure if I should be excited or terrified of the inevitable Bootstrap implementation built on this, but I know some neat stuff is going to come of it. Another big feature of preprocessors is this concept of extends. It's kind of an object-oriented implementation of CSS where classes can inherit from one another. It's a useful concept that keeps you from having to litter your markup with multiple classes. It can create some messy CSS selectors. So you can declare kind of an inheriting set of classes, and it'll generate the CSS that has the common elements in one selector, and then the unique elements to each class in other selectors. Similar to extends are mixins. Their initial use seemed to be for repeating groups of properties, especially for things like vendor prefixing. Of course, most of us have moved to tools like auto prefixer for that, which itself will be dead soon anyway, as vendors have stopped with this vendor prefixing nonsense. There are other uses for them, though, as they can accept arguments. But I think that starts to get us into an area where we've gone a little bit too far down the rabbit hole, abstracting away from what CSS actually is. Of course, that's an entirely different conversation. Feel free to find me this week if you want to argue about it. So where do those stand? Well, I was having lunch with Tab Atkins a few weeks ago. He represents Google in the CSS working group. And he was telling me that this might actually be easier to implement, extends that is, might actually be easier to implement natively in CSS than it even is in preprocessors. He's written a proposal and passed it around the working group mailing list. There seemed to be a fair amount of interest in it, so we'll see where it goes. And while there's no direct equivalent to mixins in the work, at least not that I could find, I think that the combination of extends and native variables might start to fill in those gaps. And again, it's about different ways of thinking about how CSS is evolving, not necessarily a one-to-one correlation from a preprocessor. Nesting. So you're already familiar with my feelings on it. With great power comes the ability to really make a mess of things. But I'll admit, there's definitely an opportunity for some syntactic sugar. If JavaScript can get classes, we should have something nice too. So you can see that in here, you can use these nesting, and it starts to generate a fair amount of CSS. Well, CSS Selectors Level 4 has a bunch of new pseudo-selectors that will make our lives easier, though this is probably my favorite one. This will target the same elements as that previous code, and is actually faster for browsers to parse than manually listing out all the variations, which, of course, is what the nested preprocessor code would end up spitting out. So speaking of syntactic sugar, there's another proposal in super early draft stages for extensions to CSS. This is really more of a bunch of kind of open issues. You can find this link later. That this might allow us to enhance CSS ourselves. The document is still pretty much that list of open questions, but it's an interesting read nonetheless. One example is that of defining custom selectors, so that instead of typing all of, say, the heading elements every single time you want to target them all, you can call them this heading selector and use it once and continue writing CSS as you normally would have. So it's kind of like variables for selectors, although there's some other stuff that comes with it. As I'm sure you've heard, web components are coming, eventually. While they don't map to a preprocessor feature directly, I think they allow us to solve similar problems in a different way. Namely, once we've gotten the hang of using them, some of our global scope issues might start to fade away. There's a bit of a drama going on with them where certain vendors might have kind of been pushing forward without the collaboration of all of them. There's a Mozilla Hacks blog article you can give a read if you want some insight onto that. Remember the import statement? Preprocessors have kind of repurposed this over the last couple of years. If you use it in a preprocessor, it's going to concatenate your files together. This is because its original use in vanilla CSS, while useful theoretically, had the unfortunate side effect of making another HTTP request, which, as you might be familiar, is not so great for performance. So we built our modular preprocessor files and glue them all together into one massive style sheet using the preprocessor's behavior, and then serve that up to the user. Now, I don't know if you've heard of HTTP 2, but it's going to change the way the web works at a low level. With respect to CSS, it's actually going to make many current best practices considered harmful. Instead of concatenating files together, it's going to be better to make them separate requests, since they won't block one another. And they can be called only when needed. This has some great implications, not just for building modular code, but also for caching. If one of the files changes, the client doesn't need to download the huge compiled static CSS again. Complete side note, did you know that CSS imports support media queries? I had no idea when I discovered that when I was researching this, because I was taught not to use these import statements. My mind was kind of blown. Anyway, if you're building a site that's going to be served up using HTTP 2, you want to know in advance so that you can change your build and development process and help the browsers figure out what assets to load and when, rather than just shoving everything into one massive file and throwing it down the pipe. So one last item I want to talk about is container queries. You might have seen Matt Marquis' great article last week on the responsive issues community groups' efforts to make container queries a thing. For those of you not familiar, container queries are this theoretical syntax that allows us to style elements based on their parent's container size, instead of just being tied to being responsive to the viewport using media queries. As I was actually headed up here on Monday, there was an interesting conversation happening on the GitHub repo for container query use cases, where Tab Atkins was talking about some implementation problems and how they might be solved. The current suggested solutions get us about 95% of the way there using just CSS. But it's possible we'll need to sprinkle in some JavaScript magic to get them working as desired, avoiding things like infinite loops and such. So while there's nothing specific to say about them, keep your eyes peeled, maybe take a look at some of the W3C drafts for the contain property. And maybe we'll have one more powerful tool to add to our bag of tricks in a few years. So preprocessors, they're definitely a great testing ground. I actually emailed Chris Epstein, who's one of the core maintainers of Sass, to get his thoughts on the evolution of CSS and the idea that it might replace tools like Sass. While he doesn't necessarily think that Sass is going to anywhere in the short term, he said that the Sass team loves the direction CSS is moving in, even if it ultimately obsoletes their technology. One of the early goals with Sass was to show the CSS specification authors how adding programming to our style sheets would actually simplify them. And you know what? They seem to have succeeded at that. Back when Sass was first created, there was a post on the W3C about why CSS variables were not coming to the native language. And the times have changed. So what do we do? If you look at JavaScript, it's kind of gone through this transformation already. CoffeeScript was a thing for a bit, and now we've moved on to using transpilers like Babel to build sites using tomorrow's syntax today. Now, this isn't something that's always possible in CSS for a lot of the examples I've shown you. Obviously, there are tools like PostCSS hitting the scene, but they can only go so far in allowing us to use tomorrow's stuff today. As CSS-only polyfills are not quite the same as they are in JavaScript. Of course, there's also the new hot drama about CSS even being necessary at all with tools like React building our components with styling built in. I don't want to discount that, as there's definitely fills a need as well. So preprocessors and CSS are going to be useful for quite some time. But we should continue to use techniques like progressive enhancement to bring in new shiny whenever possible. All the while, CSS specification writers are looking at what preprocessors are doing and trying to find solutions for the root problems, rather than merely addressing the symptoms with pretty syntax that might have compatibility issues when you look at the bigger picture. The king isn't dead. He's just carefully planning what's best for his subjects.